One hot off the press for you guys via the USA Today, titled "Republican State Lawmakers Want to Punish Schools That Teach the 1619 Project." So lawmakers in several state houses this year want to stop lesson plans that focus on the centrality of slavery to American history, as presented in the New York Times 1619 Project, previewing new battles in states over control of civics education. So I don't need to go into how shitty K through 12 is if it's from the government. I mean, it's at the very least, it's just absolutely staggering waste of time. I'm of the mind that it's one of the greatest scams literally ever, simply by virtue of the staggering amount of time that we are, most of us at least, basically forced to waste in these lack of concentration camps that provide us with virtually no value. I mean, even the left will talk about how it's like, well, you know, you had the kid for 13 years, he graduates and he can't do shit, he can't even work at McDonald's. I mean, that'll be a thing of the past anyway once burger flipping becomes automated, which will be a problem for people starting off in the economy. But as the government has shown time and time again, they don't give a fuck about us. Now, I haven't read Nicole Hannah-Jones' book on the 1619 Project. I'm entirely certain that it's just BS revisionist history. I don't really think slavery was all that central to American history. If you think about it, the North was able to win the Civil War because they didn't use slaves, and that fact is rarely touched upon when you see people kind of go on about the Civil War. I'm of the mind that, as well, with respect to the Civil War, that slavery was just used as a propaganda piece to kind of rally people behind the cause. It was really about big government versus small government, centralization versus decentralization, and we see that, you know, in the centuries in the wake of the Civil War, that the centralized government, even though it won in that conflict, has basically ran the country into the ground. So Republican lawmakers in Arkansas, Iowa, Mississippi, Missouri, and South Dakota filed bills last month that, if enacted, would cut funding to K through 12 schools and colleges that provide lessons derived from the award-winning project. All right, that's a good thing. Like I said, the 1619 Project, it's a load of horse shit. I guess to say it won an award, I mean, that's linguistic propaganda 101, when the organization that gave it the award is the Pulitzer Prize Foundation. That's been a joke for decades now, as far as I knew. Unfortunately, the bill in South Dakota has since been withdrawn, so it looks like the most stand against culture that they're willing to do in South Dakota is limited to the lockdowns. They deserve credit for that, but it would have been nice to see them continue, fighting against this wave of leftist lunacy that we're dealing with in the United States. So some historians say that the bills are part of a larger effort by Republicans, including former President Donald Trump, to clarify a more white and patriarchal view of American history that downplays the ugly legacy of slavery and the contributions of Black people, Native Americans, women, and others to the nation's founding. I don't know how women who are ostensibly white, given that the United States for most of its history was a white majority country, are at all helped by the 1619 Project. I think they just throw them in there because that's another class of, another protected class that they like to use as a sacrificial lamb on the altar of their lunacy. But it's not really, like, they're kind of framing this in a messed up way, because, as I just said, the United States is a majority white country. So to focus on the achievements of whites and the things that whites did to bring the United States where it is today, I mean, that has nothing to do with white supremacy so much as it has to do with what happened. Like, it's, as far as patriarchy, I mean, the United States was a patriarchal nation. It's really not anymore. If anything, we're more of a matriarchy now, unfortunately. But if you look at the difference between the United States now versus then, when it was more patriarchal, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that it's any better now. I mean, sure, we have more technology, but the state of our culture is, it's an absolute disarray. So political battles have long been fought largely in education boards over how American students learn everything from the Civil War to ethnic studies and health. And health here, just so you know, is a code word for teaching butt sex to 5-year-old children. It's, absolutely disgusting in that regard, but they'll couch that, like at the St. Clair County Community College, where I unfortunately pissed away 3 years of my life. We had a health class that was, like mandatory education at the time, and it was all about trans people. And this was the very beginning. This was back in 2013, the very beginning of how, this stuff just exploding onto the scene. And that's, there's nothing healthy about the type of shit they're talking about, I can tell you that much. But proposed legislation that would penalize schools for teaching curriculums based on the 1619 Project signals a new era of policy debate over civics education that may increasingly play out in state legislatures. So I don't think it's so much of a debate of how they're teaching civics, because they don't really teach you jack shit again in K through 12. It just has to be, it's a debate and a fight over which view of the narrative we're going for. I mean, you guys know as well as anybody else that the left is very good at co-opting, subverting, and changing things around, especially when it comes to linguistic propaganda that make it a lot easier to push their BS, because it's fundamentally nonsense, and that's what you have to do when what you're saying is just nonsense. So the project, which was first published in the New York Times Magazine in 2019 and for which its creator, Nicole Hannah-Jones, won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary, marked the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first known enslaved Africans in the British colonies that became the United States. It includes audio, essays, poems, graphics, and visual art pieces that reframe the legacy in contemporary American life, arguing that Black Americans are the foundation of U.S. democracy. I have no idea how they would make that sort of stretch. Again, like I said, the North was able to beat the South in the Civil War largely because their economy was more efficient, because it wasn't reliant upon slave labor. Now, I'm not trying to say that black people played no part in American history, but just by virtue of their status as a minority, it can't be any bigger than whites, or I don't think it's also equal to at all. If you go look back at, you know, who is it that's coming up with these inventions? Who is it that's coming up with these scientific ideas? Usually it tends to be white men, and that's not something that's unique to America. It seems to be kind of a thing in the West as a whole. So unfortunately, that gets used as ammunition to say, oh, well, you know, it's a racist country because only white men are coming up with stuff, when it's like, well, I don't, like, what, nothing has ever stopped any black man or any woman or any other minority from coming up with scientific achievements. So maybe something else is at play instead of the classic boogeyman of white supremacy. The Pulitzer Center, in partnership with the 1619 Project, has made available related lesson planning and says more than 4,000 educators from all 50 states have reported using its sources. Here we get the appeal to the mob. Oh, well, everybody thinks it, so it must be valid. That's, you know, couldn't be farther from the truth. The fact of the matter is that 1 + 1 = 2. It doesn't matter if you go find 400,000 people that disagree with you. I'm sure they're out there in the world somewhere. Consensus has no impact on the truth. That is a fact. So to say that 4,000 educators from all over the state or all over the country have used its content, I think really just speaks to the degree to which our educators for decades now, it's especially bad now, but are fundamentally just brainwashed leftist hacks that arguably take advantage of children to kind of instill their nonsense. I mean, like I say, I finished going to high school before all this shit really just exploded in terms of how common it was. And even then, like, there was nothing about racism or sexism or all this other nonsense, but there was always a left-wing sort of progressive lean that, you know, you give off as somebody who agrees with those things. I don't care what political party you're a part of. If you're in charge of teaching, no matter what, or that you're in favor of rather, you know, it's going to come out in what you say, just because it's teaching. Like, you have to, you know, what are you, some friggin' robot automaton? Well, I guess most of these teachers are, but anyway, while some historians, again appealing to the masses, have criticized parts of the project, the Times has stood behind it. Yeah, because the New York Times is just a fountain of solid information and a great historical institution, right? A more recent editor's note, further defending the project, acknowledges that the newsroom's separate opinion section has published pieces against it. Oh, wow. They're staying balanced over there at the New York Times, right? And other historians have praised the project's approach and rigor and treatment of the role of white supremacy in U.S. history. And this is the other thing, is they constantly talk about white supremacy, white supremacy, white supremacy. It's like, you are in a majority white country. If I go to anywhere in Africa, I don't get to have any white supremacy. In fact, by these people's logic, I would be right to complain about black supremacy, because as a disadvantaged white minority in a black majority country, it puts me at a disadvantage for everything. But you never see them sort of applying their rationale to other situations, primarily because it fundamentally doesn't make sense, and primarily because a lot of this stuff just goes on in the US to help spread division. You know, it's not about healing or bringing people together. That's just some bullshit sleepy Beijing Biden Joe said. You know, they don't give a shit about that. The more, if the people are even remotely united, I mean, that presents a massive problem for the elites and the ruling classes, because instead of looking at each other and fighting each other, they might look up and go, hey, you know, maybe we should adjust things here peacefully, legally, of course. Experts in history criticized Republican legislatures for supporting bills that make such an overt move to force teachers to gloss over parts of U.S. history. Okay, that's pretty sensible, I would say. It comes after a year in which many Americans have protested systemic racism. Systemic racism doesn't exist. within U.S. institutions, and education has not been immune from that conversation. Top Republicans, including Trump, have expressed support for nationalist propaganda, which is good. I support nationalism, especially for anybody who lives in a country. Like, why I don't understand how it makes sense in these people's minds to go, well, maybe we should give power to China. Maybe we should. It's always China, never Russia, by the way. Maybe we should give power to Russia. They never say stuff like that. It's always just America last, fuck the United States. And I think that's because a lot of people in our media and in our political system are kind of bought and paid for by China, by outside entities. But yeah, America first all day, every day. I don't know why. Like, the thing of it is that we in the United States and maybe in other countries like Great Britain, we're the only ones that throughout history have kind of voluntarily given up power. So if we give all of our power to China, do you think they're going to be nice to us? Do you think they're going to spread freedom under the guise of their imperialism? And even have a semblance of liberal values or anything that came from the Enlightenment? No, of course not. Do you think they're going to cede any power to the United States? No, they're going to crush us under their fucking boots after they used us for decades, really at the behest of our own politicians, to suck money out of here, screw over the working class in America, and become very rich over there. So that's why I'm nationalist, among many other reasons. But do we want historical facts and details that are researched and published by experts taught, or do we want nationalism taught? Well, that's just the thing, is that these leftists, and they do this with the coronavirus scam, they always appeal to experts and this, that, and the other thing, but it's like experts, not all of them agree. And you enter a point where it's like you either have to become this cultish worshiper of people who have credentials, or you have to think for yourself. Because if we're talking about, let's say, coronavirus, what if a doctor doesn't agree with another doctor, or if one immunologist doesn't agree with another one? Where does that put you, the layman? And so with stuff like history here, which is across the board open to interpretation, not to the degree that the 1619 Project perverts what actually happened. And I don't even know where to begin or keep going with that. But, do we want nationalism taught? Said T. Jameson Brewer, an educator and assistant professor at the University of North Georgia. That's a very scary sort of suggestion that schools would engage in ideological nationalism for political needs. It's really not. The United States did that for many years, and if you look at kind of what happened to our country as a result of focusing on America first, it was great for us here at home. Maybe not other people out in the world, but they don't give a fuck about us either way. And if they were in our position, they'd be doing the same thing. So it's like you don't voluntarily give up power to people who you are fundamentally competing with. So, and then to suggest that schools don't or haven't for the entire time they've been controlled by the government engage in some kind of ideological this, that, or the other for political needs is ridiculous. I mean, the 1619 bullshit has politics wrote all over it. Do you think that ideological motivation has nothing to do with that? So it's that whole Saul Alinsky thing where it's like accuse the other side of that which you yourself are doing in order to kind of sow confusion. So the anti-1619 Project bills, which come after Republican U.S. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas filed related legislation last July, are brief and use similar or identical language. The legislation out of Arkansas and Mississippi both call the project a racially divisive and revisionist account of history that threatens the integrity of the Union by denying the true principles on which it was founded. I completely agree with that statement. The Iowa bill expands its threat to school funding by suggesting any teachings with any similarly developed curriculum could face repercussions. It should face repercussions, because it's bullshit. It's even more bullshit than the stuff they've been teaching in K through 12 for the last 60 years anyway, So maybe that's what we got to do, is just crank up the nonsense to 11 to kind of, after COVID, folks are kind of seeing that the whole K through 12 thing's a scam, so that's a good thing. But maybe the silver lining here is that folks will eventually just get so friggin' fed up with K through 12 that they're going to stop sending their kids there. And once enough people do that, we might get really fortunate and have people kind of buck the trend against, these egregious level of property taxes we're paying out here. So some Republican governors have also proposed using state money to shape how history is taught. In November, Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves proposed spending $3 million in a patriotic education fund that would allow schools and nonprofits to apply for money to provide teaching that educates the next generation in the incredible accomplishments of the American way, of which there are many, especially when you go back to decades prior. I mean, the things that the United States was able to accomplish is absolutely amazing. Still, in the wake of all this COVID crap, we live in one of the freest nations in the world. As far as I know, we're the only country that has free speech codified. I mean, obviously it's shat all over in every single way that you possibly could think of. We're the only country that has codified rights to own firearms and all this other great stuff. And so to sit there and say, no, we're not going to focus on that, we're going to focus on slavery, which, by the way, was engaged in by a minority of Southerners. And you might raise an eyebrow if you go back and look at the limited data that's available of the ethnic composition of slave owners back then. So just look into that. I won't say anything more. But in a budget proposal, he wrote, across the country, young children have suffered from indoctrination and far-left socialist teachings that emphasize America's shortcomings over the exceptional achievements of this country, which is totally true. And it's not often, at least I think, that I agree with mainstream Republicans. Like I've said earlier, I'm not a big fan of the GOP, but this is better than I could have said it, because that's what has happened. And it's been building up to sort of this crescendo that we're seeing now with this whole nonsense about the 1619 Project, which is just blatantly wrong, revisionist, and ultimately very racist and anti-white. In South Dakota, Governor Kristi Noem last month proposed spending $900,000 for a curriculum that teaches the state students why the U.S. is the most special nation in the history of the world. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Trump also tried to push patriotic education, creating a 1776 commission that released a report on Martin Luther King Jr. Day that was criticized for its inaccuracies and erasure of black people, Native Americans, and women, and was quickly taken down by President Joe Biden after he took office. So that's the thing, is they always throw under the minorities and the women under the bus. It's like, the thing of it is, like, with respect to women, like, the way that they classically at least have contributed to society was not out in the open in political fields and with inventing all sorts of cool things and making scientific discoveries. And I think it's very shameful of our culture to have, in that regard, really shit upon the idea of motherhood and that sort of thing, because keep in mind, without children being raised by attentive mothers, or without these children being born, there wouldn't have been these inventors. So it's like, okay, you know, you want to have the central role, purportedly, that the mainstream media likes to pretend that these white males had, when it's like, if there wasn't a woman to have had them in the first place, they wouldn't have existed. So who in that regard has the more sacred role? I would argue the woman. So, and then as far as this other stuff goes, if you look at leftism and socialism ideology as a whole, there is this component of self-hatred that is involved in almost all of it. And I think what they're trying to do is systematize that and kind of spread it as far and wide as they can to children in the United States, because it goes right hand in hand with subjectivism, redistributionism, Marxism, and all this other bullshit. So I think what we're seeing is a right-leaning or Republican state sort of picking up the resins, as it were, trying to push forward with that exact same agenda, just at the state level. James Grossman, executive director of the American Historical Association, which represents more than 12,000 historians, has been tracking the anti-1619 Project legislation. He expressed concern about efforts at the state level to omit the roles of racism and white supremacy in American history. So again, white supremacy is largely a boogeyman. Racism, there was definitely a lot of that in, like, the classical context, not in the modern context, where racism is, you know, you're racist if you're white because you're a member of the dominant ethnic group or whatever in a particular country, which, as I said, they never extract and apply to other black or Mexican or whatever majority nations, so that's how you know it's bullshit. But, you know, it's interesting that they're talking about it being a problem to admit the role of racism and white supremacy when they're literally trying to omit the roles of basically anybody who was a white male that contributed to U.S. history. You cannot heal division by pretending they don't exist. Well, I mean, you don't really heal divisions by endlessly picking at any sort of possible thing you can to scream racism or white supremacy either. So the way to address divisions is to understand the history of those divisions. I think that's completely false. History happened in the past. If you want to understand why people are so divided today, I think fundamentally it comes down to laziness and a lack of critical thinking, because people are so hopelessly addicted to the bullshit they learned in K through 12 college and via the television. But to sit there and talk about healing revisions when you're literally trying to proffer a bullshit version of U.S. history over what actually happened, again, Saul Alinsky 101, right? So Caritha Mitchell, skipped a little bit there, this article's longer than I had thought. So Caritha Mitchell, an associate professor of English at Ohio State University, noted that several of the bills include language that seeks to address the 1619 Project as a revisionist, racially divisive framing of history. But she said race does not intertwine with history, only when people of color are involved. They're quoting her as saying, "That's one of the main ways this whitewashing of history happens. We don't even call it whiteness. We call those heroes. Founding fathers, American pioneers, pretend whiteness has nothing to do with those laudable labels." Yeah, because when you're living in a majority white country, you're not sitting there noticing how everybody is also white. That's stupid. Like, come on, guys. So Mitchell said the legislation on the state house level is aimed at sending a message at a time when Republicans hold more majorities than Democrats in the state house but have lost control in Congress. There's more leeway at the state level to do something to put people who aren't straight white men back in their proper place, she said. And whether they succeed or not, it is important that they're flexing that muscle of reminding people, no, this is still the United States where the people who belong in power are straight white men. Nobody's saying that. It's unclear whether any of the anti-1619 project bills will become law. Phil Jensen, a Republican representative who filed the bill in South Dakota, told the 19th in an email that he has withdrawn the legislation and is focused on other work, including a resolution that celebrates Black History Month. Okay. I have chosen to withdraw that bill as I do not feel that I can adequately address it as well as I would like to at this time. Cuck? Jensen's Black History Month resolution, which downplays America's involvement in slavery in part by claiming the country has a positive record on race and slavery, which it does. We ostensibly fought a war to end slavery, which is another side note here. Do any of these racism folks ever talk about the actions of the British Empire on a global scale when it comes to ending slavery? No. Did they talk about how a shitload of white people, again, ostensibly died fighting other white people against slavery? No. It's just white man bad, white man evil, blah, blah, blah. The blacks are always a victim. It's fucking stupid. So... Skylar Wheeler, a Republican representative who introduced the bill in Iowa, said in a statement, the legislature absolutely has an interest in preventing racist, divisive, historically and factually inaccurate and politically driven propaganda masquerading as history curriculum from being used in taxpayer-funded schools. Nice. The Republican lawmakers who sponsored the other bills did not respond to requests for comment. Grossman noted that in the 1950s, some legislatures monitored textbooks to see how the Civil War was being taught, and teachers were accused of being communist. Well, that's because they were and have continued to be. So McCarthy wasn't too far off. I don't know too much about what he said, kind of a joke there. But this has a long history in a way of the most conservative aspects of American political culture, jumping on teachers and education curriculum and caricaturing it as being somehow unpatriotic. Well, it's not really a caricature when it blatantly is often unpatriotic and incorrect a lot of the time. Decades ago, lawmakers in Arizona passed a bill prohibiting Mexican-American studies. A federal judge in 2017 ruled that the law was enacted for racial and political reasons, which made it unconstitutional. Mitchell credits Hannah Jones, who is a grifter, liar, and a hack, by the way, also a staff writer at the Times, for the 1619 Project having a profound influence on some people's foundational understandings of American history. It's a backlash to her success at getting ordinary Americans to hold themselves to higher standards. What is that higher standard? Bending the knee, and licking the boot of a black man on the streets? Come on. I think there are historical and societal conditions that give rise to this fear, and one way to deal with fear is to pass legislation that restricts it. In what sane world would that ever work? Did they not try and do that with COVID? I mean, legislating things away. Look at the drug war. I mean, that was a giant shit show. How well did legislation work in getting rid of that? So, because that way you feel like you can control what people learn, and then you can have the status quo. Hannah Jones, a native of Waterloo, Iowa, who expressed disappointment about a bill being introduced in her home state, told the 19th that she doesn't believe the lawmakers who have filed these state house bills have actually read the 1619 Project. She encouraged them and others to read the initiative before deciding how they feel about it. Again, with the feel. How about whether or not it's true or false? Who gives a fuck? Feels don't impact facts, right? So, Hannah Jones also said that no matter one's politics, she hopes people can agree that an education is about introducing differences in opinion and challenging perspectives. I think that's bullshit, especially in the context of American K through 12. It's like, dude, you need to know how to read, you need to know how to do basic math, and then you can specialize from there. What does that take? From what? Should it take you more than a year to teach kids once they're developmentally able to do those sort of things? I don't think so. So a lot of people don't give a shit about challenging perceptions and differences in opinion, and why should they? There's people on the left that don't and people on the right that don't. Why can't we just leave people alone? You know, if you don't agree with me, you don't got to watch my shit. Just like, you know, if you don't agree with the 1619 Project, you shouldn't be forced to pay for it via your property taxes. So Michelle Foster, an education professor at the University of Louisville, said much of what she learned about slavery, oh great, I lost my place there. Gotta love these smartphones, right? It's almost over. Said much of what she learned about slavery she got from her family, not school. Wow. Okay, that's a great source. She sees a connection between the Capitol riot on January 6th and the slate of bills filed linking them to a fear of a changing country. Well, I don't think people are wrong to be afraid of a country that's changing when they used to be in the minority, let a bunch of people into their country, and are now getting called racist and being abused at every possible turn. So it's not so much a changing country. The United States has been in a constant change, or a constant state of change for the entirety of existence. It's more a fear of a country where just because I'm a white man, I get passed over for jobs. By the way, I'm a quarter Hispanic. Or I get extra criminal charges or an extra harsh sentence because I'm white, just to rectify some historical misgiving that probably didn't even happen. That's what we're afraid of, because it's happening right now. Look at what I'm talking about in this article with what they're trying to do with the education of children. It's absurd and it needs to be stopped. So I think there are historical and societal conditions that give rise to this fear, and one way to deal with fear is to pass legislation that restricts it. Oh, what the hell? Okay, so yeah, it's about over now, but yeah, guys, in conclusion, the 1619 Project is absolute shite. I mean, you don't even need an education in history to see that. And the thing of it is, when it comes to history in general, like, we don't have a time machine to go back and look at it. So all we're left with is a handful of primary sources. So I mean, you can sit there and say that, folks weren't allowed to write down what they were experiencing at the time, or maybe they're not counted as an actual source for whatever we're talking about, but you really got to watch out when the left comes at us with this nonsense revisionism, changing the meaning of different words, all this other stuff, and just keep in mind that it's either all correct or it's all incorrect. Arguments are only valid if and only if there are no yada yada, so it's got to be consistent. And when you see the lack of consistency, when you see the linguistic propaganda, when you see the fact that they're going after children, that is your red flag to see that this is total and complete nonsense. So hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you later.